Nearly a century after the end of the Civil War and the dawn of Reconstruction, African Americans still found themselves fighting for their basic rights as citizens. The modern civil rights movement in the mid-20th century finally secured them.
Most historians actually date the start of the formal civil rights movement to Brown versus Board of Education. Brown really stokes the fervor of the nation. Then, in December of 1955, Rosa Parks decided as an act of resistance that she would not give up her seat to a white man on the bus.
Rosa Parks' deliberate act of resistance led to a bus boycott that thrust into the limelight a young preacher with a PhD. He would become one of the movement's most charismatic leaders. His name was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
One of the most iconic moments is the March on Washington in 1963, led by Martin Luther King Jr.
200,000 people converge on the nation's capital to rally for civil rights. They come united in one cause.
One day right now in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
This becomes visualized on the news and begins to change the way that Americans are starting to think about the civil rights movement.
As the civil rights movement attained greater visibility, it was often met with increased brutality and violence. Yet in the midst of so much sacrifice and heartbreak, the work of civil rights activists began to bear fruit.
In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of '64, and that's designed to desegregate businesses and government employment. And then in 1965, President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act of '65.
The passage of the Voting Rights Act was a monumental victory for African Americans. Tragically, just 3 years after it was passed, Dr. King would be assassinated. Many feel looking back that the movement died that day. But in fact, the movement took on new forms and continued. And it must continue today as important victories such as the Voting Rights Act are under attack.
Until we deal with the fact that the backlash is often made possible not just by the other side growing in power, but by those who claim to care about equality losing their own resolve, there will be moments of this cycle happening over and over again.
Welcome to our National History Day podcast, where we explore this year's theme, Revolution, Reaction, and Reform in History. Today, we're delving into one of the most powerful examples of all three, the Civil Rights Movement. It was a time when ordinary people caused extraordinary change, a movement that challenged long-standing systems of racial injustice and reshaped time.
Throughout this episode, we'll explore how the civil movement sparked a revolution in social activism, how society and the government reacted, and how those struggles eventually led to major change in political, cultural reforms. Plus, we'll be using both secondary and primary sources, including real-life documents from Jay's Stories Behind the Scenes of the Civil Rights Movement collection, to show what the movement looked like from the inside.
When people hear the word revolution, they usually imagine something that happened fast, like a government being overthrown, or a sudden rebellion. But the civil rights movement shows another kind of revolution, one that was slow, organized, and built from the ground up. According to Alden Morris's book, The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, this revolution didn't start with national leaders or TV cameras. It started in black churches, living rooms, schools, and neighborhood meetings. It was built by people who had been living under segregation their whole lives and finally decided that enough was enough. This wasn't about one leader saving everyone. It was about thousands of people choosing to stand up together.
What makes this truly revolutionary is that regular people took control of their own future. the National Archives preserves handwritten letters, protest flyers, church announcements, and petitions asking for the federal government to help with voting rights and protection from violence. These weren't written by celebrities. They are written by bus drivers, students, teachers, parents, and church members, people who were tired of being treated as second-class citizens. One letter from a student in Mississippi simply asked to be allowed to attend a clean, safe school like the white students. That simple request shows how unfair life was and how powerful their courage had to be.
One of my favorite examples from the J-Story Behind the Scenes collection is a set of meeting notes written by local activists planning transportation, housing, and safety for protesters. These notes include listed things such as carpool routes to avoid police roadblocks, houses where people could safely sleep, volunteers assigned to bring food, and locations where people could regroup during emergencies. This proves that the movement wasn't just random or messy. It was an organized resistance. Every march, every sit-in, every boycott, it was all carefully planned.
And the Stand for King Institute highlights the strategy too: nonviolent resistance, sit-ins, bus boycotts, peaceful marches. It wasn't spontaneous. It was trained, rehearsed, and intentional. People were trained not to fight back, even when they were screamed at, spit on, beaten, or arrested. That was a level of self-control. Takes unbelievable strength.
Think about that for a sec. These activists weren't just fighting laws. They were fighting fear, hatred, and violence without using violence back. So before any laws changed, the revolution started with people deciding that business as usual couldn't continue. And that single decision triggered a chain of events that reshaped the country.
Whenever there's a revolution, there's always a reaction. And the Civil Rights Movement faced some of the most intense reactions in American history. According to the Liberty Congress, many states and local governments in the Deep South tried to protect segregation by 1. Passing new discriminatory laws, 2. Arresting peaceful protesters, 3. Sending police to intimidate communities, and 4. Even protecting white supremacist groups. Instead of listening to the protesters, many leaders doubled down on injustice.
And the reaction didn't just come from politicians. It came from regular citizens who wanted to keep the old system. PBS documentary shows a peaceful protester being dragged out of buildings, threatened by mobs, sprayed with fire hoses, and attacked by police dogs. All for trying to sit at lunch, counter, ride a bus, or vote.
There's a powerful primary source from the independent Voices archives on JSTOR that really shows how personal discrimination was. An underground newspaper reported that some businesses posted signs banning black customers during protests. This shows that racism wasn't just big speeches on TV, it was daily life. It was deciding where someone could eat, shop, or walk.
Meanwhile, federal leaders were under massive pressure. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture explains how television completely changed the fight. When Americans saw a peaceful protester being beaten on live TV, the world saw the contradiction between America's claim of freedom and the reality of injustice. Suddenly, the Civil Rights Movement wasn't just a Southern issue. It became a national crisis.
But the reaction from the government wasn't immediate. At first, many officials tried to ignore the violence or quietly control it, but major events like the Birmingham Campaign, the Selma to Montgomery March, and the March on Washington made it impossible to stay silent.
In a strange and painful way, the violent reaction actually helped the movement grow. It showed the world exactly what activists were facing and forced more people to choose a side. It turned a regional struggle into a nationwide demand for justice.
Out of all that revolution and reaction came something real and lasting: reform. The Civil Rights Movement led to some of the most important laws in U.S. history. The Liberty of Congress highlights two of the biggest: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to segregate public places, schools, buses, and restaurants, and many workplaces. It also banned racial discrimination in hiring. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended literacy tests, poll taxes, and other tricks that were used to stop Black Americans from voting. This finally made voting a protection of federal responsibility, not just a state decision.
And these reforms didn't just appear on their own. They were forced into existence by pressure. The primary sources show letters begging the government for protection, protest plans demanding fair treatment, and speeches calling out hypocrisy and injustice. Eventually, Congress had no choice but to act.
Reform also showed up culturally. The movement changed the way Americans thought about justice, equality, protests, citizenship, and the freedom itself. According to the Stanford King Institute, the Civil Rights Movement inspired future activism in women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, disability rights, and immigrant rights.
The Smithsonian Digital Exhibit explains how these reforms shaped American identity. Ordinary people became national heroes. Students, parents, workers, grandparents. They proved that history isn't just made up by presidents. It's made by people brave enough to stand up.
And reform is still ongoing today. The Civil Rights Movement didn't fix everything, but it built the foundation for what we're standing on.
So Alex, how does all of this connect to this year's theme, revolution, reaction, and reform?
The revolution was the rise of organized, nonviolent, community-driven action that challenged centuries of racial inequality.
This reaction came from governments, police, citizens, and national leaders. Some resisted fiercely, some slowly changed, and the violence exposed the truth.
And the reform came through new laws, new rights, and new awareness that changed the nation.
When we look at the primary sources, letters, flyers, and protest schedules, we see people who had no idea how history would remember them. They weren't powerful, they were just determined.
And the secondary sources help us understand how those small moments created massive change. Historians like Alden Morris show how thousands of local actions connected into one national movement.
The Civil Rights Movement proves something important. Revolution doesn't always look explosive. Reaction isn't always supportive. And reform isn't the end. It's just the beginning.
The Civil Rights Movement is one of the strongest examples of how revolution, reaction, and reform shaped history. It changed the law, it changed communities, and it changed what freedom truly meant.
And its legacy is still alive. It reminds us that reform never happens without courage. And that courage often comes from people whose names we never even know.
Thanks for listening to our National History Day podcast. We hope this helped you see how civil rights movements connects to the theme and why it is impactful today.
Until next time, keep asking questions, keep researching, and keep exploring history.